I wake up before the sun rises, a familiar heaviness pressing on my chest like a weight I didn't ask for but learned to carry anyway. It's not just the physical tiredness. It's something deeper, a fatigue wrapped in anxious anticipation. I lie there, eyes wide open, heart steady but mind racing through worst-case scenarios like a relentless storm brewing just beyond the window. What if this month's bills don't get paid? What if something unexpected happens? The questions circle endlessly, and no matter how many times I try to quiet them, they come back louder the next morning. I'm not alone in this. There's a kind of silent suffering that many of us share, and it doesn't always look like poverty in the obvious sense. It hides behind the scenes of everyday routines, in the subtle ways money controls our thoughts before it even touches our hands. I know because I have been there, caught in the same cycle of dread that makes every financial choice feel like walking a tightrope over an endless pit. It's as though my brain is wired not to build or dream, but simply to survive the moment. When I think about money, it's never with a sense of possibility or growth. It's a quiet, pervasive fear that something will slip through my fingers. That safety I crave feels just out of reach, no matter how hard I try to organize, plan, or save. Every time I make a move, whether paying a bill early, trying to budget, or even looking at investment options, the invisible pressure tightens like a fist around my heart. I tell myself it's just being careful, but inside, something else whispers louder. What if it's not enough? What if I make a mistake and lose what little I have? There's a strange loneliness that comes with this kind of financial anxiety, a feeling that no one really understands what it's like to be exhausted and afraid at the same time. I see people around me talking about wealth, security, and freedom. They share stories of building, achieving, and thriving, but for many of us, the language feels foreign. Our story isn't about celebration. It's about hanging on, about putting out fires we didn't expect and hoping the flames don't get too close. I remember nights when I'd stare at the ceiling, calculating, recalculating, trying to stretch every dollar until it became more than it was. But the harder I worked to control my finances, the more erratic my decisions became. There were moments when desperation pushed me to act impulsively, quick fixes that only made things worse. Sometimes I would cancel bills, or skip meals, or borrow from one place to cover another, creating a tangle of responsibilities that felt impossible to unravel. And through it all, the constant companion was fear, the fear of scarcity, the fear of failure, the fear of not measuring up. It's hard to admit, especially to myself, that this experience isn't about laziness or lack of willpower. It feels like being trapped inside a mental system designed only for emergencies. Like my mind learned long ago that the best it could do was to put out one fire after another, so it forgot how to build a solid foundation. The endless alertness, the hypervigilance, the jittery tension, that isn't strength. It's survival mode, and it's exhausting. This internal story we live can quietly sabotage every bit of growth we try to create. What if our mindset, the very way our brain responds to money, is keeping us from moving forward? What if the reason it feels impossible to break free from financial struggles isn't about how much we have or don't have, but about how deeply wired we are to expect lack? There's something powerful and painful in realizing that the enemy isn't just external circumstances. It's a part of ourselves, hidden, overwhelming, yet profoundly human, that refuses to let go of fear. Yet, even in that realization, there's a seed of hope. Because once we recognize where we are trapped, it becomes possible to imagine a different way of being. I want you to know that this isn't a story about blame or failure. It's about understanding the hidden battleground inside all of us who have felt worn out by money worries. It's about recognizing that beneath the surface of what looks like bad choices or procrastination lies something much more complex. A survival mechanism that's been running nonstop and needs to be seen, honored, and gently untangled. So here we are, at the starting line of a journey that isn't just about budgets and spreadsheets. It's about looking inward, facing the invisible weight we carry, and beginning to uncover a new way to live with money, one that doesn't drain us but strengthens us. Together, we'll explore how this survival mode works, why it keeps us stuck, and most importantly, what it takes to shift into a place where clarity replaces chaos and abundance replaces anxiety. Because the truth is, the hero of this story, you, me, us, is not just the person trying to make ends meet. The hero is the part of us ready to stop surviving and start truly living. And that's a transformation worth stepping into. In those moments when I sat staring at the ceiling, the clock's steady ticking seemed to echo the rapid beats in my chest. It wasn't simply worry. It felt like my mind was caught in a labyrinth, twisting and turning without an exit. Every choice related to money felt like stepping on shaky ground, as though beneath my feet the earth could give way without warning. This persistent unease wasn't a fleeting emotion. It had settled deep, etching itself into my very perception of what financial decisions meant. I didn't just hesitate. I froze, paralyzed not by indecision, but by an internal alarm that shouted, "Danger ahead." The incessant chatter within convinced me that any misstep would be catastrophic, as if each dollar spent or saved held the weight of my entire existence. On a particularly restless night, I found myself recalling a scene from childhood, my parents caught in a heated argument over bills left unpaid. The tension was palpable, their voices edged with frustration and resignation. I remember hiding in my room, heart pounding, watching the flicker of anxiety pulse through the household like a shared secret. Over time, these early impressions became like a blueprint etched into my subconscious, shaping how I processed financial stress as an adult. This was not consciously stored knowledge, but a silent script my brain replayed in moments of pressure, a script that urged me toward caution, but paradoxically urged haste and panic when confronted with monetary choices. Once, when I received unexpected expenses, the instinct was immediate and unwavering. I would scramble, juggling payments and cutting corners with a frantic urgency that sometimes cost me more in the long run. This impulsivity contrasted sharply with my desire to act thoughtfully, creating an exhausting dichotomy. It was like being twice at war, one front battling external problems, the other fighting against my own instinctual responses that undermined my efforts to regain stability. No budget or plan could fully shield me because my mind had developed a reflexive tunnel vision, narrowing every option to the least risky-seeming path, no matter how limited or short-sighted. It's striking how this way of thinking hijacks rational insight. One instance I recall, I received a bonus at work, an unexpected influx of funds that could have been a fresh start. Instead of relief or excitement, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The immediate impulse was to stash it away in the farthest corner of my bank account, almost as if hiding it. Spending even a little seemed reckless despite knowing better. The internal conflict was profound. Part of me wished to breathe easier, the other clutched tightly to an ingrained message to never loosen my grip. This dichotomy created an invisible cage that held me back, trapping me in a cycle where relief was perpetually out of reach. I started to notice patterns in how my mind treated financial challenges like slamming doors rather than open windows. When an unexpected bill showed up or a payment deadline loomed, rather than creating space for flexible solutions, I rushed to close off options. This reaction was so reflexual that it became almost automatic, a defensive posture that shielded me momentarily but also blocked me from seeing creative paths forward. Like a knight who raises a shield at every noise, bracing for attack instead of scanning the horizon, I limited my own capacity to grow financially. The irony was brutal. By trying to avoid loss, I often missed chances for gain. Now, consider how this applies when you face a sudden financial decision. Perhaps an opportunity to invest in education, start a side project, or even negotiate bills. That internal tightening, that rapid heartbeat, triggers a cascade of judgments that quickly narrow what feels like a calm sea into a choppy puddle. Rather than stepping back to evaluate the bigger picture, the mind dives immediately into worst-case scripting, where the safest choice is always one that avoids risk, even if it also avoids potential benefit. This automatic response is like a broken compass, pointing away from growth and toward the familiar terrain of limitation. Reflecting further, I realized this combativeness is not a weakness, but a deeply ingrained survival reflex carried forward from earlier experiences where risk literally felt like danger. The brain locked itself into a launch first, assess later mode, quick to pull back and aggressive in protecting what felt scarce. Recognizing this allowed me to see how my thinking did not follow pure logic, but reacted under the influence of emotional sediments accumulated over years. This insight revealed why simple advice on budgeting or financial planning often felt ineffective. I was trying to solve a complex emotional equation with procedural solutions only. An enlightening experience occurred when I began documenting these mental and physical responses, writing down how my body tightened, how my thoughts spiraled, and what stories replayed about past failures helped form a bridge from chaos into clarity. I discovered that these episodes were not random, but followed a pattern linked to specific triggers: unexpected bills, invitations to spend, or even conversations about money at work. This deeper awareness slowly chipped away at the unconscious hold these fears had. When I caught myself in the act of tightening or rushing decisions, I reminded myself to pause and introduce a new rhythm: breathe, question, reflect. Yet, lifting oneself from this whirlwind is neither immediate nor linear. There were times when old instincts surged back full force, moments when progress felt like a flicker in the dark. But the act of naming and observing these automatic responses began to erode their power. It was like discovering the strings controlling a puppet. That knowledge gave me a chance to step behind the scenes, to gently untangle the knots rather than be dragged by them. The road ahead involved patience and repeated practice, but each moment of conscious interruption opened a space where new habits could begin to grow. In this way, processing my financial challenges became less about the digits and more about reshaping the invisible narrative running inside, the unspoken dialogues of worry, self-judgment, and protective urgency. And with every conscious breath taken in the eye of this storm, I found fleeting moments where fear's grip loosened just enough to glimpse what hope might feel like. I remember once sitting at a cafe, clutching a cup of lukewarm coffee, while my mind darted between countless financial worries. It was a peculiar kind of numbness, as if my brain had crowded itself with so many negative predictions that it couldn't settle on any one course of action. This paralysis wasn't a result of ignorance or lack of desire. It was the product of a mind trapped in a loop where each new thought triggered another wave of tension. At that moment, I understood that my struggle extended beyond concrete circumstances. It was entwined within the neural pathways of anticipation and self-protection. Even the simplest financial discussions, like deciding whether to dine out or cook at home, grew into internal battles over control and safety. During that same afternoon, a pattern began to reveal itself more clearly. I noticed that my reactions to financial challenges were often disproportionate. For instance, an unexpected $50 expense could spark a level of distress, as if I were facing an insurmountable crisis. This disproportionate response stemmed not just from current means, but from accumulated experiences that taught my brain scarcity equaled doom. It was as if my inner alarm system had been calibrated to trigger at the slightest hint of resource depletion. Yet, while this alert kept me on edge, it simultaneously narrowed my vision, reducing my ability to weigh options with nuance or allow myself a moment of relief. A distinct turning point came when I realized I was engaging in what felt like an exhausting mental tug-of-war. On one hand, part of me sought stability through strict routines, painstakingly tracking expenses, refusing any financial indulgence, believing discipline would create safety. On the other hand, another part acted on impulse, grabbing fleeting chances to spend, often on little comforts, as a way to soothe an internal ache. This contradictory behavior confused me. I thought I was just inconsistent, but eventually, I came to see it as the mind's desperate attempt to satisfy conflicting needs, to feel secure and, simultaneously, to feel alive or worthy. In exploring this, I came across an analogy that resonated deeply. Imagine a ship caught in a storm, frantically throwing crew members between plugging leaks and navigating rough waves without a coherent strategy. The ship represents my financial life. The storm, the unrelenting anxiety driving my decisions. Both efforts, damage control and progression, felt equally necessary but were working at odds, exhausting the crew and putting the vessel at risk. This metaphor helped me recognize that surviving chaos required different skills than those needed to plot a course into calmer seas. Knowing this was crucial because it meant I couldn't rely solely on reactionary survival techniques if I wished to steer towards growth and peace. Another layer I discovered involved the relationship between my self-worth and money. Reflecting on my internal dialogue, I found an undercurrent of judgment entwined with my financial choices. Success or failure with money often became a mirror reflecting my personal value. For example, if a budget slipped or a bill was missed, I'd hear a harsh inner commentary. Words like irresponsible or not good enough, echoing louder than any external voice. Such judgments intensified distress, creating a toxic cycle where emotional wounds and financial setbacks fed into each other. Awareness of this connection illuminated that my challenges were not only monetary but deeply emotional, calling for compassion as much as strategy. I also began to notice how avoidance played a significant role in undermining my progress. On days brimming with despair or exhaustion, I'd close my eyes to certain bills or put off opening bank statements, convincing myself I was protecting my peace. However, these acts of evasion only reinforced anxiety by allowing issues to accumulate unseen. It was akin to ignoring an engine warning light on a car because the noise was uncomfortable. The more I avoided, the bigger the problem grew, eventually forcing confrontations under even more stress. Recognizing this pattern made me face an uncomfortable truth. Avoidance fed into chaos instead of alleviating it, requiring a new approach rooted in commitment to facing financial realities with gentle honesty. There was a breakthrough after an evening spent journaling, where I allowed myself to write without censorship. I captured vivid descriptions of the physical sensations that arose during financial stress, the tightening in my chest, the dull ache in my stomach, the clammy palms, and alongside them, the swirling thoughts that often hid beneath. By mapping these experiences, I craftily exposed hidden triggers and responses, enabling moments of detachment and curiosity rather than automatic reaction. This practice became a lifeline in untangling complex emotions tied to money, transforming them from sources of dread into clues guiding toward change. And so, I started to experiment with novel ways of interacting with my finances, introducing rituals not driven by obligation, but by intentional care. For example, once a week, I'd set aside dedicated time purely to review my money situation without pressure, creating a ritual similar to tending a garden. I didn't rush or criticize. Instead, I observed progress and setbacks with an open mind, acknowledging small victories rather than dwelling on imperfections. This shift in attitude slowly loosened ingrained tension, fostering a relationship with money that felt less adversarial and more collaborative. I also realized that connecting with others facing similar struggles offered powerful relief. Sharing vulnerabilities about financial exhaustion in safe spaces reduced the isolation so often compounded by embarrassment or shame. Knowing I wasn't alone in wrestling with these invisible burdens changed the narrative from one of personal failure into a collective experience of resilience. Conversations became sources of insight and encouragement, reminding me that healing begins with connection. Through these unfolding discoveries, I came to understand that grappling with financial survival mode required more than surface solutions. It called for an unraveling of deep-seated habits, a gentle unfolding of the tangled threads binding stress, self-image, and behavior. Each new insight acted like a key unlocking a small door within the labyrinth of my mind, leading me further away from blind reaction and closer to intentional choice. This path, though challenging and uneven, held the promise of reclaiming control, not just over bank accounts, but over the unseen dynamics that govern how we live and relate to the world of money. I used to think my brain was just wired to react instinctively to money stress, but then I noticed how often my thoughts would loop endlessly, circling back without resolution, like a record stuck on the same groove. It wasn't only the content of my worries that trapped me, but how my mind was interpreting every financial flicker as an immediate threat, shutting down any room for curiosity or creativity. Imagine a smoke detector that goes off at the faintest hint of steam from the shower, not discerning between genuine danger and everyday activity. That's how my mental circuitry operated, flooding me with alarm signals even in safe situations, effectively blocking any chance of calm or rational planning. I recall a day when I received a modest, unexpected windfall, a gift from a distant relative. Most people might have smiled, maybe even splurged a little or invested it wisely. I, on the other hand, felt a surge of unease that crept beneath the celebration. My first impulse was to question if accepting that money was a mistake, if it somehow legitimized my fears of never having enough. That internal hesitation wasn't about the cash itself, but about the deeply ingrained message that abundance is suspicious, fleeting, or even undeserved. This belief formed an unseen barrier, sabotaging my ability to embrace positive financial experiences comfortably. At one point, I started recognizing how this mental pattern influenced my bodily sensations in real time. When a bill arrived, or I considered spending, a cold knot would tighten in my stomach, and my chest would constrict as if someone had packed my ribcage with stones. It was an instinctual freeze, a shutdown signal telling me to avoid action because the unknown felt overwhelming. It struck me that my body was in on the story, mirroring the turmoil my mind wove. This realization led me to explore how stress isn't simply a thought process, but an embodied experience, amplifying the difficulty in stepping outside ingrained cycles. One evening, after a particularly challenging week of bouncing between hope and dread, I sat in my car parked outside a convenience store. I held two options: buy something practical for dinner or skip the expense and face the gnawing hunger. The argument inside was fierce. One side urged immediate satisfaction, a reward for enduring so much pressure. The other chastised me for risking financial balance for comfort. This tug-of-war wasn't about the cost alone, but was deeply tangled in how I judged my needs and worthiness. Ultimately, I chose to buy a simple meal, but the emotional aftershocks, shame mixed with relief, reminded me just how complex my relationship with money and self-care had become. In conversations with close friends, I sometimes noticed how my tone shifted when discussing my budget or expenses. I'd become guarded or dismissive, hiding the anxiety beneath a veil of stoicism. It was as if acknowledging vulnerability might confirm some internal verdict of incompetence. Yet in sharing these struggles openly, the walls began to crumble. It dawned on me that loading financial conversations with judgment only entrenched fear and isolation. Opening a dialogue filled with curiosity and kindness rewired these encounters, creating space for empathy and new possibilities. Later, I encountered a method where people described financial resilience not as about how much money you have, but how you respond emotionally to money stress. This struck a chord. In my case, resilience hadn't been cultivated. Instead, avoidance and reactive panic ruled. I began to think of my mind as a garden, overrun with invasive weeds of worry, crowding out the blooms of hope and creativity. It became clear that nurturing resilience would take intentional care, watering seeds of confidence, and pulling out self-defeating beliefs. Determined to shift this, I started using deliberate grounding techniques whenever financial tension struck. In a particular instance, sitting at my desk surrounded by unopened bills, I squeezed a small stress ball and focused wholly on its texture, reminding myself that these papers were possibilities, not guarantees of disaster. By redirecting attention from chaotic thoughts to tangible sensations, I created pockets of calm where insights could emerge. This practice helped me resist the automatic spiral into helplessness, offering a brief bridge between fear and action. Simultaneously, I came to understand how my brain's appetite for certainty led me to cling tightly to rigid rules. No splurges, no unexpected expenses allowed, effectively boxing myself into corners. But life, I learned, rarely conformed to such binary thinking. I began experimenting with flexibility, allowing predetermined, safe spending for joy, accepting that budgets might need adjusting, and embracing the messiness of progress over perfection. This mental loosening felt like removing weights chained to my ankles, lightening my steps as I navigated financial terrain with more grace. One turning point was listening to a podcast where a guest spoke candidly about money mindfulness, being fully present with financial emotions without judgment or hurry. Inspired, I tried sitting quietly before making any significant decision, noticing the tightness in my chest without trying to change it, simply observing. Over time, this cultivated a subtle shift in my relationship with uncertainty itself. I came to appreciate that discomfort was not a fault, but a signal guiding me toward greater self-awareness. Now, consider how this applies when temptation presents itself. Say, a sale on something you desire or a chance to invest in a course that could enhance your skills. Earlier, I would have reacted from scarcity-fueled panic, snapping up purchases, or retreating in fear. But by tuning into my evolving inner state, I could approach such moments with a clearer lens, assessing alignment with my deeper priorities rather than knee-jerk impulses. This intentional engagement transformed moments of risk into opportunities for empowerment instead of traps of anxiety. By reshaping my internal experience from reactive fear to reflective presence, I began to reclaim authority over my finances and, more profoundly, over the emotional atmosphere that had once dominated every decision. This wasn't about erasing uncertainty. It was about developing a new literacy of feelings, learning their language without becoming overwhelmed. The journey continues, but each step reveals how much power lies in perceiving fear not as a prison, but as an invitation to recalibrate and grow. One evening, I found myself pacing my small apartment, the hum of the city outside contrasting sharply with the storm brewing inside my mind. I had just received an unexpected notice. A late payment fee slipped through, unnoticed until it was too late. Instead of calmly addressing the issue, a tidal wave of frustration surged through me. It wasn't the fee itself that overwhelmed me. It was the creeping realization that despite my efforts, I was still tangled in a web of setbacks. My thoughts spiraled, imagining the cascade this single mistake could trigger. Future bills piling up, credit scores nosediving, doors closing before I even reached them. That night, I understood something crucial. The mental landscape of scarcity does more than cause anxiety. It actively shrinks our horizon, narrowing vision until every small incident feels disastrous. In the following days, I began to recognize that this constricted perspective extended beyond money alone. It seeped into my very sense of possibility. Opportunities whispered past me, muffled by the incessant voice in my head urging caution. For instance, a colleague mentioned a workshop that could propel my career forward, but my mind quickly recalculated the time and expense, flagging risks that overshadowed potential gains. This internal dialogue operated like a protective gatekeeper that prioritized safety over growth, locking out scenarios where investment could flourish. It dawned on me that living in this mode resembled steering a ship with only one sail unfurled. Power was there, but its expression was limited, conditioned by fears that concealed wider seas. I recall a vivid dream during that period, a vast, fertile garden strangled by dense vines, struggling for sunlight. In the dream, I wandered through paths blocked by overgrowth, aware that beyond the barriers, a nurturing space awaited, but unable to reach it. This image lingered, becoming a metaphor for my own internal blockade. It became clear that the mentality dominating my decisions functioned as a guard holding back not only abundance, but also hope. The walls built to protect me from loss paradoxically imprisoned me from expansion. Recognizing this paradox was painful yet liberating, a first step towards seeking freedom beyond survival instincts. One afternoon, I shared these reflections with a close friend who listened intently before offering a striking insight. She suggested that constant vigilance acts as a second skin, thin, taut, and reactive, but so constricting it limits movement. Her words conjured a new sensation within me, the weight of perpetual alertness as an invisible armor, exhausting but invisible to those around me. I realized that this armor, while forged from necessity, had become my main barrier to transformation. The challenge wasn't merely about mastering money. It was about releasing the defensive shell without exposing myself too abruptly to vulnerability. Determined to loosen this grip, I started cultivating small moments of intentional detachment. I carved out weekly pockets in my schedule solely devoted to exploration, reading personal finance books, watching talks, jotting down aspirations without judgment. Unlike my past approach steeped in urgency and desperation, these sessions were gentle investigations where mistakes and uncertainties were allowed. They reminded me that curiosity might be the antidote to fear's rigidity. Slowly, my mind stretched toward possibility, like a hand reaching through a crack in a closed door to glimpse the light outside. A memorable experience came when I attended a community event focused on entrepreneurship. Surrounded by individuals sharing stories of both setbacks and breakthroughs, I saw reflections of my own struggles cast in different light. A speaker recounted how early failures with clients taught resilience and sharpened her business acumen. Hearing this, I felt a shift I hadn't anticipated. Rigid notions of success loosened, replaced by an understanding that progress is often nonlinear and messy. This framing offered reprieve from the relentless self-criticism I harbored and introduced a narrative where setbacks weren't doom, but chapters in growth. Amid these changes, I began experimenting with mindful spending. One Saturday, eyes closed, I held a receipt from an unplanned purchase. I allowed myself to dissect the emotions behind that choice without censure. Instead of labeling it irresponsible, I acknowledged it as an act seeking comfort during a taxing week. This self-compassion opened doors in my psyche I hadn't known existed. The simple act of reframing transformed financial decisions into dialogues of care rather than judgment, softening edges that once cut sharply. Another dimension emerged when I confronted deep-seated messages internalized from upbringing. Whispers equating worth to withholding, success to sacrifice, security to scarcity. Dismantling these ingrained narratives demanded uncomfortable honesty, but I found journaling helpful in naming and challenging each belief. I wrote letters to my younger self, offering solace and affirmation she lacked. These dialogues became steps in untangling shadows cast from history, paving pathways toward reclaiming my autonomy. Now, consider how this unfolds when unexpected expenses appear, normally triggers of panic and retreat. With practice, I learned to pause and invite a different response, curiosity instead of alarm. What possibilities exist here? I'd ask, what resources or support might I discover? This shift from reaction to reflection felt like switching from autopilot to manual control, cumbersome at first, but steadily empowering. By embracing uncertainty as an invitation to explore rather than a signal to withdraw, I began reshaping my lived experience, cultivating resilience that extended beyond numbers to mindset itself. There was a moment when I found myself gripping the edges of a worn-out chair in my kitchen, trying to steady the storm of thoughts swirling inside my head. Bills lay scattered across the table, some unopened, and my mind raced, not toward solutions, but to worst-case scenarios of failure and loss. In this space, logic seemed muffled by a persistent shadow of self-doubt. I noticed my pulse quicken, a sharp tightness gripping my chest, as if my body was preparing for imminent danger. Strange though it sounds, I realized that the instinct guiding my financial responses resembled survival tactics honed in moments of physical threat: fight, flight, freeze, with no middle ground for calm deliberation. Building from that realization, I began examining how this instinctual mode hijacked the delicate balance between emotional reactivity and cognitive processing. I saw that when stress escalated, my brain categorized every financial decision as life or death territory. For example, a text notification about a charge on my bank account generated a surge of adrenaline akin to narrowly avoiding an accident. In those flashes, automatic reactions eclipsed thoughtful reflection. I understood then that this mechanism was a neurological echo, an ancient safeguard misaligned with the complexities of modern financial navigation. One pivotal day, after narrowly missing a payment deadline, I caught myself spiraling into harsh self-criticism. The reprimands echoed louder than any external voice. "You messed up again. You'll never get ahead." Yet, as I sank into despair, a quiet question arose. What if these judgments weren't truths but echoes from a vulnerable place inside? This shift wasn't immediate, but gradually softened the sharp edges of self-reproach. I started allowing space for imperfection and recognized that rigid self-judgment intensified the very cycle I wished to escape. This internal dialogue took on the texture of a weary conversation between a stern parent and a frightened child, both holding deep fears and hopes. Gradually, I uncovered that several unconscious patterns played out in my financial behavior, masked by what I assumed to be rational decision-making. For instance, I often chose quick fixes or immediate relief, like buying inexpensive distractions, to soothe the emotional bruising brought on by mounting pressures. These tactics, while soothing short-term, invariably deepened underlying issues, forming a feedback loop of relief followed by regret. In essence, my self-soothing strategies echoed those of a marathon runner pausing to ease cramps, but ignoring the niggling injuries undermining long-term performance. Outwardly, I tried maintaining a composed visage, though internally waves of anxiety churned relentlessly. My friend Sarah once noticed my preoccupation during a casual dinner and gently asked, "What weighs on you lately?" The simple question revealed cracks in my armor and invited an unexpected moment of honesty. I spoke about the exhausting tension that made every financial choice feel like a performance under a spotlight. Her response, free of judgment, full of warmth, felt like finding an oasis amid a desert of isolation. This encounter illuminated the power of connection to dismantle internalized burdens that often thrive in silence. Delving deeper, I also realized that my stress frequently anchored around unpredictable fluctuations rather than fixed amounts. The unknown carried more terror than concrete numbers. For example, receiving a paycheck that varied week to week triggered unease disproportionate to the actual income. My mind fixated on the possibilities of sudden loss, as if the economy itself was a volatile beast crouching in the shadows. This obsession with variability fragmented my capacity to plan confidently, binding me to short-range thinking, one cautionary step at a time. An experience from my early days at a new job crystallized this pattern. Given a freelance contract with irregular payments, I found myself trapped in cycles of feast and famine, moments of fleeting abundance followed by crippling scarcity. Rather than adapting to this flow, my attempts to micromanage every dollar became frantic exercises in control that sapped creativity and joy. Over time, I recognized that my resistance to financial uncertainty was less about the practical facts and more about the emotional turmoil they provoked. These insights compelled me to script a different narrative, one that embraced unpredictability without surrendering to it. In pursuit of this reframing, I experimented with mindfulness techniques during monetary stress. Instead of racing through a cascade of distressing thoughts, I trained myself to anchor attention on sensory experience. A deep breath, the feeling of the chair beneath me, the sounds of life passing by outside. In one intense moment, I closed my eyes while sitting at my desk cluttered with unpaid invoices and allowed a wave of tension to wash over without pushing it away. That act of radical acceptance paradoxically diminished panic and opened a sliver of clarity. I liken this practice to standing in a rainstorm, not fighting the downpour, but letting the water soak in, cleansing rather than drowning. This acceptance also revealed a hidden adversary in my mindset, an all-or-nothing mentality. I often measured financial progress by stark metrics, either success or failure, with no room for nuance. Such rigid dichotomies magnified each setback and diminished small victories to insignificance. Slowly, I began cultivating awareness that growth in financial well-being resembled a dance rather than a race, full of steps forward and backward, pauses, and pivots. Recognizing this rhythm infused resilience into my journey, tolerating imperfections while still maintaining steady intention. Now, picture the next time you witness an unexpected expense appear on your horizon. Instead of immediately bracing for impact or retreating into defense, you might pause, feeling the emotional charge in your body and naming it without judgment. This act creates a new space where thoughtful response can emerge, maybe a call to negotiate terms, a temporary reprioritization, or simply an affirmation that challenges are part of the unfolding story. Through repeated practice, this shift gradually reprograms the conditioned reflexes, enabling us to move beyond survival reflexes and into a realm where flexibility and creativity guide our steps. All these threads weave into a mosaic illustrating that the psychological mechanics behind financial stress are complex, layered, and deeply intertwined with identity and emotion. My journey continues as I unravel these connections, cultivating kindness, curiosity, and courage along the way. One afternoon, I caught myself shrinking away from my mailbox, heart racing not for fear of bills, but because opening it meant facing layers of complexity I'd been avoiding. The letters piled up, their envelopes crinkling with silent accusations, yet I postponed confronting them, as if delaying would dissolve their weight. It struck me then how avoidance had become a double-edged sword, a temporary refuge that birthed a more tangled mess. This hesitation wasn't mere procrastination. It was an unconscious defense defending fragile nerves from abrupt shock. In a conversation with Mia, a friend from work, I confessed this pattern without disguise. She smiled gently and said, "You're not alone in this labyrinth. Many navigate its twists quietly." Her kindness cracked open a door I hadn't realized was sealed, revealing a truth. Avoidance, though draining, was not a flaw but a symptom of overwhelm. This shift in perspective helped me stop battling self-recrimination and instead observe my behaviors with compassion, a first step toward dismantling a fortress I hadn't willingly built. Underneath this dynamic lay an invisible force, our brains craving for certainty. I started understanding that the unpredictability of finances launched my nervous system into an unrelenting state of hypervigilance. Often, I noticed my thoughts orbiting around what-ifs, with magnetic pull, snapshots of hypothetical crises painting vivid pictures of despair. For example, a sudden expense wasn't simply inconvenient. It summoned an entire reel of imagined disasters, each more catastrophic than the last. These mental reels hijacked focus, feeding anxiety and burning mental energy that could otherwise have nurtured problem-solving. Embarking on experiments with self-reflection, I recorded moments where impulses to ignore challenges coincided with a surge in physical tension, a clenched jaw, shallow breathing, a tightness settling in my gut. This somatic awareness sparked new recognition. My body and mind weren't disconnected adversaries, but intertwined allies communicating distress. Embracing this unity, I began cultivating practices that acknowledged bodily signals, like pausing to breathe deeply when noticing tension rise, fostering a dialogue with myself that untangled fear with curiosity instead of judgment. One night stands out vividly. Stress had warped time. Each minute dragged, thick with dread, as I sat calculating bills and deadlines. Instead of yielding to overwhelm, I reached for an unconventional tool, a simple glass jar filled with colorful beads. Each bead represented a small victory, an on-time payment, a fruitful call, a reframed thought. Slowly sliding one into the jar created a tactile counter-narrative to mental chaos. This ritual grounded me, anchoring abstract hope in tangible movement, reminding me progress blossoms in incremental acts. Yet, even rituals couldn't fully silence the inner critic that equated financial missteps with personal failure. I remember a moment when an unavoidable late fee triggered waves of shame washing through me. The sting of perceived incompetence was brutal, leaving traces of self-doubt lingered long after the immediate stress subsided. Recognizing this ingrained judgment as a separate voice from my true self was pivotal. It invited me to differentiate between identity and action, to realize I was not my mistakes, but an evolving individual navigating complex terrain. Exploring the stories woven into my mindset, I uncovered inherited narratives shaping my relationship with money. Family voices echoing warnings about scarcity, sacrifices, and the essential nature of frugality had etched deep grooves in my psyche. These echoes, once unquestioned, started to reveal themselves as outdated scripts, written in fear but no longer serving growth. I envisioned them as shadows cast by ancestors struggling in different times, noble but no longer helpful in today's context. Gently rewriting these narratives took patience and persistence, like learning a new language spoken by hope and possibility. When I faced moments demanding financial choices, my mind often bled caution, squeezing away spontaneity. For instance, at a surprise invitation to join friends for a weekend trip, an automatic tally of costs overshadowed excitement. This inner accountant weighed every expense against safety, often vetoing experiences that could nurture joy and connection. Through reflection, I recognized this habit limited not just money but life's richness. Gradually, I challenged myself to balance prudence with openness, allowing room for generosity toward myself without guilt. Occasionally, embracing vulnerability proved transformative. During a late-night call with a mentor, I admitted exhaustion from financial battles that never seemed to ease. She offered a new frame, viewing my journey as a heroic struggle not defined by perfection but by resilience and growth. This reframing shifted the burden from personal deficiency to courageous persistence, illuminating capacities I'd overlooked. It underscored that healing involved integrating every facet of experience, embracing discomfort as a compass guiding toward renewal. Now, Consider when you encounter an unexpected bill that floods your mind with unease. Imagine pausing to notice not only thoughts but the sensations coursing through your body, the quickened heartbeat, restless energy, or perhaps muscle tightness. Instead of reacting instinctively, you invite awareness to these signals, offering space for response over reflex. This practice carves out a gentle pause, transforming reactive loops into conscious interactions. Each moment thus becomes an opportunity to rewrite internal programming, paving pathways toward thriving beyond survival impulses. There was a morning when I awoke with a sense of numbness settling over me, a heaviness disconnected from specific worries, but pressing so firmly it blurred my focus. Instead of a sharp pang of anxiety, it was this dull fog that clouded my judgment, making choices appear distant and drained of meaning. In that state, I realized my mind was operating on autopilot, reacting to financial matters without genuine engagement. It was as if my spirit had checked out, settling into a monotonous rhythm where decisions folded into routine rather than intention. This apathetic layer nestled beneath the surface, quietly eroding my ability to envision or cultivate change. That day, a moment crystallized this inertia. When faced with reviewing my monthly expenses, I shuffled papers mechanically, eyes glazed with fatigue. The numbers danced, but did not awaken any spark of insight or motivation. A friend texted, asking about my progress toward a financial goal, and I responded curtly, hedging my uncertainty with forced optimism. This exchange left me hollow and slightly ashamed. It became evident that beyond fear and tension, withdrawal had crept into my relationship with money. The dullness was its own form of resistance, insulating me from discomfort but also from opportunity. Later, during a brief walk in the park, I observed the vibrant energy around me. Children chasing frisbees, vendors setting up stalls, light filtering warmly through the leaves. The contrast to my internal lethargy unsettled me. I understood that numbing oneself emotionally often serves as a shield against overwhelm, though at the cost of vitality. Like a phone with a fading battery, my ability to connect with aspirations and fears alike had diminished. This realization impelled me to confront the subtle exhaustion that had taken root, a quiet drain that undermined action from within. In the weeks that followed, I experimented with micro-rituals to reclaim presence and wakefulness. One such ritual involved pausing each time I accessed financial documents, taking 3 deliberate breaths, and tuning into my senses. The rough texture of paper, the shifting weight in my hands, the smell of ink or electronic glow. These small acts fostered grounding, bridging the gap between numbness and awareness. Slowly, fragments of clarity began to emerge, snippets of genuine inquiry replacing scripted responses. This shift was neither swift nor smooth. Moments of fog still returned, but with time, they grew less oppressive. An encounter with an unexpected phone call deepened this journey. A mentor's voice carried warmth and curiosity as she asked, "What's keeping you distant from your money story?" Her question unraveled layers I hadn't dared examine. I admitted feeling disconnected, not from necessity, but from exhaustion born of constant vigilance. The confession lifted a veil. It highlighted that in addition to surviving urgency and fear, I was also grieving the loss of emotional engagement. Accepting this grief opened space for tenderness, a nurturing energy that had often felt foreign in my financial world. Building on this awareness, I noticed patterns of avoidance surfacing in everyday scenarios, postponing budgeting sessions, evading conversations about money, or defaulting to minimal involvement in financial planning. These behaviors resembled subtle acts of surrender, veiled under practical excuses. Yet, beneath lay an unspoken plea to pause, recuperate, and find equilibrium. It dawned on me that ignoring exhaustion mimics pouring water into a cracked vessel. Partial measures can stabilize temporarily, but true repair demands attention and care. One afternoon, I stumbled upon an old journal entry describing a dream where I was wandering a desert, searching for an oasis that shimmered just out of reach. The metaphor struck a chord. My emotional detachment mirrored this endless pursuit, a longing for relief and renewal that remained elusive. Unlike past interpretations rooted in despair, I now saw the dream as an invitation to seek restoration actively, not passively. It challenged me to acknowledge the subtle fatigue whispering beneath my composure and to welcome patience as a companion rather than an adversary. Encouraged by this insight, I crafted a gentle weekly practice. Sitting in a quiet corner with a cup of tea, I allowed myself 15 uninterrupted minutes to reflect on feelings connected to money, not to solve problems or set goals, but purely to observe. These sessions felt like watering a wilted seedling, offering nourishment to parts one had long neglected. Gradually, I noticed a softening tension around financial topics, which in turn paved the way for renewed curiosity and hope. The shift extended beyond numbers, impacting self-perception and daily rhythms alike. Discussing these experiences with a close friend illuminated the broader context. She remarked on the social stigma surrounding emotional fatigue linked to finance, noting how silently endured burnout often masquerades as failure. Our conversation unraveled the myth that financial acumen requires unflagging energy and unshakable resolve. Real power, we agreed, arises from embracing humanity, including vulnerability and rest. This reframing felt revolutionary, a balm dissolving the harsh voice that once chastised me for feeling drained. Now, consider how this applies when exhaustion stifles your capacity to engage with your financial reality. Instead of pushing harder against resistance, you might step back to honor tiredness with kindness, perhaps through brief pauses, moments of self-compassion, or reconnecting with sources of inspiration unrelated to money. Such attitudes transform fatigue from an adversary into a guide, signaling where renewal is needed. Over time, embracing this cycle fosters resilience grounded in self-awareness, allowing financial decisions to emerge from a place of balance rather than depletion. Reflecting on this journey so far, I find myself standing in a quiet clearing after traversing a dense, tangled forest. Each turning path, each shadowed nook, has revealed fragments not only of struggle, but of subtle transformation. It's as if the limits that once hemmed in my vision have softened, allowing a glimpse beyond survival's immediacy into horizons shaped by something gentler, yet more profound. In this stillness, the echoes of my earlier turbulence begin to weave together, forming an unseen tapestry whose texture is both delicate and resilient. There's an undeniable sense that beneath the surface currents of fear and fatigue, a web of awakening has been quietly spun. The relentless tension that once demanded every ounce of my energy now appears as a signpost, inviting me to pause and listen differently. The invisible grip that once molded my decisions with an iron hand loosens its hold, unveiling spaces where clarity can seep in like filtered sunlight through canopy leaves. It's not an abrupt revelation, but a gradual unveiling, an invitation to shift from reactive instinct to thoughtful presence. I notice that emerging awareness often arrives wrapped in paradox. The recognition of vulnerability becomes a wellspring of courage. Embracing uncertainty births creative possibility. As I move deeper into this inner terrain, the fragments of past conditioning no longer operate as chains, but rather as familiar landmarks that I can choose to walk alongside without being bound. There's a newfound capacity to discern when ancient alarms have served their purpose and when they signal outdated threats disguised by present-day anxieties. This gentle discernment acts as a compass, guiding choices anchored less in panic and more in attuned reflection. It's akin to learning a new language spoken not in the tremors of fear, but in the quiet rhythms of resilience and hope. Through this lived experience, I sense a shifting interplay between surrender and agency. It becomes clear that flow is not synonymous with passivity, nor is control a fortress impervious to change. Instead, these forces dance in dynamic tension, sometimes yielding, sometimes asserting, allowing fluid adaptation within an ever-unfolding landscape. This dance demands trust in oneself to navigate uncertainty not as a threat, but as fertile ground where new patterns can emerge. In this rhythm, the heart learns to move beyond survival's narrow beat into the steadier pulse of intentional growth. While the hidden architecture of my mind once constructed barricades against scarcity, I find that those walls are porous, inviting light and possibility to enter. There's a fragile invitation to reimagine value not as something earned through unyielding vigilance, but as an ever-present essence awaiting recognition. This subtle shift brings with it a delicate balance, honoring the past's lessons without allowing them to dictate the contours of the future. It feels less like a destination reached and more like a horizon approached, ever expanding, cracked open by glimmers of something renewed. I realize that the space between struggle and liberation is not empty, but alive with potential. It hums with the quiet work of rewiring, where old fears gently lose their voice as newer narratives find expression. The journey through anxiety and exhaustion reveals itself as a process akin to refining, removing dross to reveal underlying strength and brilliance. Within this process, patience becomes a cherished ally, and self-kindness the thread stitching fragmented parts into a coherent whole. At times, I catch myself noticing the subtle ways my body and mind begin to coalesce rather than clash. The physical tension that once announced crises now softens as a message rather than a mandate. I learn to greet these sensations with a companion's curiosity, allowing inner signals to guide rather than command. This developing dialogue fosters a sense of agency embedded in compassion, transforming once unyielding impulses into opportunities for conscious choice. In these moments, financial decisions slowly evolve from tasks burdened by dread into acts imbued with intention and even grace. The narrative shifts, no longer penned by scarcity's harsh hand, but authored anew in a voice that harmonizes caution with openness, strategy with hope. This evolving melody underscores an emerging truth, that abundance begins not in external accumulation alone, but in the tender recalibration of inner landscapes. Together, these threads coalesce not into a neat package of answers, but into a living mosaic inviting me forward. The path ahead is neither fixed nor fully illuminated, and that uncertainty is no longer a source of fear, but an invitation to creativity and growth. I feel the stirrings of possibility beckoning, whispering that beyond survival's confines lies a terrain rich with potential freshly glimpsed, ready to be shaped by courage, clarity, and renewed purpose. There were nights when exhaustion settled into my bones so deeply it seemed impossible to rise above the relentless barrage of worries. I'd lie awake, the ceiling's blank canvas reflecting my restless mind, while my heart insisted that any moment could unleash a new crisis. Yet over time, I discovered a strange, fragile power in surrender. Not surrender as defeat, but as the recognition that fighting an invisible storm with sheer force alone wasn't my path forward. I learned that when the weight pressing inward softens, even just a little, space opens up for something unexpected, light. I remember one quiet morning when, instead of plunging headlong into tasks designed to control and contain, I allowed myself a moment of stillness. The sunlight streamed in gently, dust motes dancing lazily, and I acknowledged the trembling beneath my surface, the fear that had dictated so much of my existence. But in that acknowledgement, something shifted. Fear did not dissolve, but it became less like a hammer and more like a warning sign, a signal inviting care and attention instead of urgency and panic. That day was not a triumph with fireworks, but a soft unfolding, like buds slowly unfurling after a long winter. It whispered that healing unfolds in rhythms I can respect, not speed I must command. Across the years, the ways my mind tried to guard me from loss gradually revealed themselves as stories honed by past struggles, stories that began to unravel when I stopped trying to silence them. Deep inside, these narratives resonated with a yearning not for scarcity, but for security, for belonging, for peace. Recognizing this allowed me to open a quiet dialogue with myself, a tender inquiry into the roots of my anxiety that did not blame or chastise, but simply sought to understand. In those conversations, old armor sometimes cracked, making room for gentler truths to shape my choices. One afternoon stands distinct in my memory. I sat with a friend whose own journey bore echoes of my own, and together we spoke of the invisible pressures we carried. Her words didn't carry solutions. Instead, they held a mirror of companionship, reflecting back resilience I had forgotten was there. "You are not alone in this," she said softly. "The weight you bear is shared, sometimes silently, sometimes out loud, but it's never something you face without allies." That moment helped me understand that healing threads itself through connection as much as insight, that vulnerability weaves strength rather than weakness. I also slowly grasped the paradox that safety could sometimes become the very cage I tried to avoid. By clinging to rigid controls and desperately avoiding risk, I constructed walls that blocked fresh air and sunlight. Some decisions once made out of protection became limitations that stifled growth and joy. Embracing uncertainty required courage, a trust that life's ebb and flow could store richness even amid unpredictability. It was as though I stepped off a cliff and discovered not a bottomless fall, but a new landscape shaped by possibility, waiting to be explored with open eyes. Ultimately, I came to hold a vision of prosperity that begins internally, a quiet sanctuary sculpted from self-awareness, kindness, and patience. This vision invites me to meet my fears and hopes as roommates in the same room, honoring each voice without domination. In this space, decisions emerge from clarity and calm rather than chaos and compulsion. Money is no longer an adversary nor a distant prize, but a companion whose language I am learning to speak with empathy. If I could speak to the parts of us trapped in exhausted vigilance, I would say this: you are more than the sum of your fears and struggles. The impulse to survive has been a fierce guardian, but it is not the whole story. Beneath that protective armor lies a wellspring of resilience waiting to flow in new directions. Approaching this wellspring requires gentle persistence, small acts of courage, moments of grace, the willingness to look inward without judgment. The path is not straight or easy, yet it is always there, winding through the wilderness toward a horizon rich with the promise of renewal. So now, when the familiar tightness beckons and the mind drums out warnings, I strive to meet it with curiosity instead of resistance. I invite myself to breathe, to listen, and to trust that my capacity to navigate complexity grows stronger with each step. This ongoing unfolding is not only a journey toward financial ease, but a deep reclamation of agency, an awakening into a life where presence, hope, and abundance dance in quiet harmony. And in this rhythm, I find a story worth living fully, one heartbeat at a time.